Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of things. This is a schmooze day, and on schmooze days, people can say what's on their minds. I'm going to say right off the bat what's on my mind, and that is the Glasgow meeting of the COP, the panel on climate change. So I hope somebody has other thoughts to share about that, because I think we really have to be mindful of the upcoming events that affect us all. So I have a terrific panel of friends here with me, and they're all scattered around the globe. In Montreal, there's Claire Adamson, who's a retired architect. She was telling me about having participated in designing the Toronto Library as a triangle, because you get more wall space that way compared to floor space. Do you know that? I didn't know that. In Berlin is Doug Saunders, who is probably familiar to a lot of folks. He is the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. And he's there interviewing people about how cities should function, among other things. In, I guess, Oakville, Barbara Birkett is a retired dermatologist, very active in the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada branch. And she has some up-to-date hot news about what IPPNW has to say about COP. And in Vermont, or I guess you're in Vermont, are you, Bill?
Yes.
William Ryerson, who is the head of the Population Media Center. Have I got it right?
That's right.
And he is somebody that I always consult, because I think his work is so amazingly important. He makes soap operas to have messages to inform and change public opinion and public behavior about reproductive issues, population growth, etc. So I think I really think his work is important, and that's how we're going to really change. That's the only way I know of changing culture. I want to especially say hi to Doug Saunders, because he's been a regular on these schmooze days in the past, but now that he's spending 3 months in Europe, I haven't seen him for a while, and I'd like for him to kick off his concerns and preoccupations at the moment.
I'll tell you one thing that's captured my thoughts about that. A few days ago, I had a really good interview with Samantha Gross, who was a senior climate official with the Department of Energy in the States, and now she runs the Climate and Energy Initiative at Brookings, I think. And she wrote a really interesting report over the summer looking into the tricky aspects of decarbonizing heavy industry. And it was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I think, like many sort of semi-informed and read people on the zero carbon transition problem, I had assumed that the biggest slices of the pie, the ones we need to take care of to reach net zero by 2050, are decarbonizing the energy grids and transportation sectors in the largest economies. And as Meta often talks about, probably a little slice of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it as well. And Samantha Gross pointed out that we're missing a fairly large slice that tends to get subsumed under those other things, which is the challenge of steel, concrete, and chemicals, which are huge, well, but not just steel, metals, concrete, and chemicals, which are big, big, big contributors and are not easily electrified in all cases. And not only that, we'll have much larger demand if we want to go for a zero carbon transition and protect ourselves against the ocean rises and so on that are going to happen. We're going to need to really vastly increase production and consumption of those materials, particularly concrete. And her report points out that steel is the easy piece. So of course, we've had electric arc steel mills for a century or more, And you can do that. Other metals are more, and aluminum's always been made with electricity, but other metals are trickier. Chemicals are intrinsically tricky because they're petroleum based, and many of them, and plastics and so on, many of them, the act of fabrication releases. And concrete's the big unaddressed, really, really tricky one, because it's not just its manufacturing, it's very, very coming into existence releases huge amounts of CO2. And not only that, but it's not a high margin industry like steel or petroleum that's centralized in large cities and can easily use some of those margins to be regulated into carbon capture and storage or electric based procedures. But it tends to be very low margin industries located in remote places and run by flaky people that's very, very hard to regulatorily decarbonize. And her report really was eye-opener. It struck me that there's a whole set of challenges that we're about to confront once we take care of the low-hanging fruit of transportation and electricity generation, that I don't know if either our policies or our technology are quite there yet.
Oh, Doug, I am so happy you brought that up, because I would love to occupy the rest of the hour, and I'm not going to, except to give you a hint. There's an answer to the concrete thing. There's a way of making concrete carbon negative, not just not carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And I printed a summary of it in the current issue of Peace Magazine. I wrote an article, which I didn't put a byline on because I'd already written something else in the article, didn't want my name all over everything. But it was called something like Some Silver Buckshot. And it was a summary of about 4 or 5 different things that could be done, one of which has to do with the manufacture of concrete. So I think what I'm going to try to do is in fact, I've been trying to reach these folks to do a talk show specifically about that, because if it's true, and I believe the source that I got, it's really important. So I agree.
Yeah.
Terrific. Okay.
The volumes of demand that'll be needed, the estimates are quite something. I mean, just the cities that have been protected against ocean level rises, like London and Venice and Rotterdam, those were the largest cement using projects in their country's histories. Never mind, we're going to have to do it with Miami and Singapore, et cetera, et cetera.
Claire, in about 1 minute, what are you thinking about these days and wish that we could talk about all day?
Well, I sure wish that they had the COP26 on Zoom. And I was really critical of people flying all the way to different countries for other climate meetings. And now I'm really sure. And I just can't figure how they can justify all that danger on the environment by just having this group. And I think more can be done by communication and research. You can have people from all over the world. You have a question, you have someone come in and talk about it. I just, this idea of people going and meeting in one place is for tourism. And I don't think it's the best way to have a scientific meeting.
Well, I agree with you, but I'm not nearly as upset about that as I am about my friends who just go for vacation and don't even apologize for doing it. They just think that it's fun to run around the world for no good reason. So there you go. I scold my friends. I've almost lost some friends already for it. Barbara Birkett.
IPPNW has just issued its statement, it is, of course, emphasizing that climate change definitely needs to be tackled immediately and vigorously, but also making the point that nuclear energy should not be part of that.
Okay,
tool.
well, I think we want to come back to that. I assume other people will want to hear what they have to say. So shall we come back a little bit later? Bill Ryerson, what's on your mind?
Well, speaking of Glasgow, I have a speaking slot at one of the side events in Glasgow, and was on a call this morning with the organizers, as well as on a call that UNFPA organized, UN Population Fund, to talk about the role of gender and reproductive health in regard to climate, particularly adaptation, but also mitigation. And I think what is often missing from climate conferences is the fact that gender and reproductive health issues are actually climate issues, as well as health and human rights issues. And clearly some UN bodies like the UN Population Fund recognize this. Project Drawdown concluded that the combination of girls' education and family planning are together the most impactful interventions that can be made with regard to climate trajectories, and among the lowest cost interventions that we have. And Brian O'Neill at University of Colorado did a detailed analysis of the cost of the low or the inexpensive technology of contraception, and concluded that even though most of the growth that's occurring in population around the world is in countries with low per capita emissions, making a major effort to promote use of family planning and reproductive health services by women around the world, leading to women being able to achieve lower desired family size, could yield roughly 25% of what is necessary to avoid catastrophic climate change.
How's that elaborate? I mean, how I remember reading that when I read the Drawdown book and thinking, wow, that's surprising that it's number one on their list, I believe, of things that you can do. But I don't think I read the explanation of how they think that's going to have that kind of impact on climate.
When you think about where population growth is occurring, it's in developing countries with low per capita emissions. So a lot of environmentalists say, well, you know, the real problem is in the West, and we need to deal with things like energy systems and transportation systems and consumption in general in the West. And that is all very true. However, the projected median growth in population in the developing world from now to 2050 is an additional 2+ billion people. All of those people have carbon footprints. And when you take that number and multiply it times their average per capita emissions without any further economic development, it's the climate equivalent of adding 2 United States to the planet. So in fact, helping women achieve smaller family size through things like girls' education and information and access to reproductive health services can yield a tremendous benefit. As I said, Brian O'Neill calculated it's 25% of what we need to achieve to avoid catastrophic climate change. So yes, it on a per person basis seems small compared to people who, like you mentioned, are flying around the world on vacation. But it is collectively, with the numbers of people involved, a huge issue. And it's also linked closely to human rights, the rights of women and girls to have an education, to wait until they're adults to be married, to have access to reproductive health services, and particularly family planning that will help them space and limit childbearing. And those win-win solutions are also highly effective at slowing the rate of new consumers who want to live like people do in the West. And so it's a big issue that is neglected on the world stage.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Will you be unique in emphasizing that there, or are there going to be a lot of other people talking about population issues at COP?
That's a good question. Certainly there will be, as I mentioned, UNFPA will be talking, as they did in a seminar this morning, about the role of sexual and reproductive health and rights as a climate issue. So I think I won't be alone in that regard. What I may be alone in is talking about the role of communications with regard to changing behavior on a global basis, using role modeling to model environmentally sustainable, healthful, and rights-based lives and livelihoods for people, which is, as you mentioned, what Population Media Center does through long-running serialized dramas.
Barbara, bring us up to date on the hot news from IPPNW.
I don't want, it's fairly long. I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but let's say it's crunch time for humanity. We have already entered an era of escalating impacts from global overheating. We need to lower greenhouse gas emissions now. And we need to recognize that humanity and the biosphere face another existential crisis of humanity's making, the growing danger of nuclear war. So they're putting those two together. We do not have the luxury of time. We have precious little margin for error left. It is vital that we make wise choices, act boldly and fast. We need win-win solutions, not measures to address one existential threat, which exacerbate the other. Enrichment plants, which can enrich uranium to both reactor or weapons grade, and accumulating plutonium and spent reactor fluid fuel are means for nuclear proliferation and increasing the danger of nuclear war, not a climate solution, but a fool's bargain. Okay, so that's.
Well, maybe what they're doing there is they're anticipating all of the pro-nuclear power lobby that will be showing up in Glasgow, and I expect they will be there in full force.
Yeah.
And
Canada is, promoting SMRs and so on.
In campaigning, what we need is a way of tying the two issues together logically and saying that they need to be addressed together because they are really connected. And I haven't seen anybody make that kind of logical connection. So it's not, there's no convincing way of saying that they are connected, in my opinion. I wish somebody had an answer to that.
Growing international tensions can easily lead to an accidental nuclear war. I think this is one of the major points.
What would be lovely if somebody could say, building nuclear weapons is bad for the climate. And nobody can say that. I mean, there's no argument to that effect.
Some of the younger activists like Ketchichan and people like that are eager to work on both existential threats. So I think the message is not just from people of my age.
Right. Okay. Claire, what do you want to bring into the picture?
Well, we all have to change lifestyle for climate. We have to grow more things at home, encourage restaurants to have local produce. There's all sorts of ways we can have respect for the climate. And it's, having fewer children is a great idea, but it's sometimes a little difficult to convince people who want to take over the world. They need their population. But I think that if we can encourage people to get to know their neighbors, have a more peaceful time, they won't need so much energy. Reading a book or staying home. And as I have my roof garden, no cottage, no travel, I think that it will help slow the world down a bit too, and make it more peaceful, so we don't have so many psychological problems.
Okay. I would be interested in how much of an emphasis is there in Glasgow on the notion of reducing our high living standard of living and quality of living. You know, I keep getting into arguments with friends about whether or not we have to go live off the land and dig our own potatoes and things. Doug, do you want to join in on that particular issue? I think you have an opinion.
Well, a lot of my work is on poverty and marginal communities and so on. And I can't see a very strong case that it could be morally justified to try to achieve a zero carbon world in a way that reduces living standards or reduces consumption. And I'm not convinced that it's necessary either. The main thing about getting to a world that treats the atmosphere well and that ideally reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is it'll be expensive. It'll require a lot of work and a lot of changes and fast. I'm encouraged to see major countries, including ones with not very progressive governments, such as the UK, going to pledging an all-electric transportation fleet by 2030, or at least to stop making non-electric vehicles. I'm encouraged to see governments beginning to grasp the size of investments that'll be necessary, both in the public and the private sectors. But all of the scientific analyses of what policy changes will be necessary and what industrial changes will be necessary in order to stop polluting the atmosphere suggest that it's going to require huge amounts of growth, huge amounts of expenditure and activity, which is good news for people. It means poverty will go down and it'll be reduced, because when things are expensive, they require a lot of people to work and be active. But we actually had an interesting natural experiment during the first 12 months of this pandemic, when air travel all but stopped internationally, which is certainly to be welcomed, because we do not yet have electric air travel. And when a lot of other things stopped and carbon outputs worldwide dropped to sort of 1970 levels, I believe. It was an experiment in which we had a 1 year period when the world was producing the levels of carbon that we hope to get to in 15 or 20 years. And what all the analyses said was that would not be enough. Even if we were to stop all carbon output right now, it would not be adequate. That we would need to put many trillions into economies, into houses, into transportation systems in order to enable those changes. So I think we need to recognize that we need a very quick transition to new energy sources that do not produce any carbon, and I would not rule out any technology in that. We need a very quick transition to transportation systems that don't produce carbon. We need to recognize that if we do not have substantial amounts of economic growth and human community growth during the next 30 to 40 years, then we're going to be in trouble, because we're not going to be able to reach those goals globally.
But the question there is, can you disconnect the current relationship between income level or GDP, so to speak, and output of carbon? Can we live sustainably, but adequately and prosperously and comfortably?
Yeah, that's an issue I've spent a lot of time on in the last few years. Mm-hmm. And there's two sides to the coin. When people become more prosperous, they do burn more stuff and more carbon, at least under current economies. But a couple other things happen when people become more prosperous. Most absolute poverty in the world is rural in nature. And it tends to take place in countries that have a lot of people living on the land. And as our other guest noted, it tends to be in countries that have out of control population growth, like Niger and Afghanistan and that sort of thing. And rising living standards move people off the land so that the land produces food instead of sustains populations. It moves people into higher population density places where you have the economies of scale and efficiencies that allow electric mass transportation and less waste. And the most important thing is that rising living standards anywhere in the world, under any culture or religion or economy, rising living standards dramatically shrink family size. And in fact, I mean, I think William has noted in his work that one of the most effective ways to decrease family size is to raise living standards and education rates of women, which are and girls, which are intimately related to rising living standards. And the more we can achieve that transition, and in fact, the converse is also true. When living standards fall, family sizes grow, which tends to be in conflict environments and places like that. Yes, each individual, when they become non-impoverished, emits a lot more carbon than an impoverished individual. But if families have 1.7 children, like like Turkey or so on do now, rather than or Iran, rather than the 8 children that they had 30 years ago, that you have to do that math as well. So you have to look at the numerator and the denominator. And I think we can hope to have a net win where we have efficiencies and forms of growth that reduce carbon output rather than increase it. We don't want a lot of families living on the land that could be used to produce food and burning wood for fuel. It's really not a good thing for the climate. Getting people into electrified cities and better standards of living and better education rates for women is surely a better way forward to a carbon neutral economy.
Exactly. Very good. You get an A+ on that little presentation. Thank you. Now, I guess, what I want to know is, where do we go from here? Are you, by the way, going to Glasgow yourself? You're close enough so that it's not that much of a flight to go to London or to Glasgow.
I tend to agree with Claire. Was it Claire who said that about everyone flying to Glasgow? Or was it Barbara?
No,
Claire?
I didn't, but
anyway, as much as I like to meet people in hallways at conferences and things like that, I do tend to agree that the image of 10,000 people flying on jet airplanes to the COP events, I think maybe we should have a rule that only people under 30 should be flown in there so that they can have the social and dating benefits of going to this thing. I mean, when you're young and you go to a thing like that, it's terrific. I think those of us who are well over 30 maybe should do it by Zoom anyway.
In that regard, I don't intend to travel there. I think to go all that distance for a 5-minute presentation is really insanity, even though it is nice to meet people in the hall. But I think Doug has touched on something very important, which is, what is our goal as a society? I think our goal is to have a sustainable population who are living well, not as many people as we can cram onto the planet who are living at the absolute level of poverty that makes it just possible to survive. So I think very good work has been done by some ecologists on what would be sustainable at the Ethiopian lifestyle, what would be sustainable at the Western European lifestyle. And once we're out of non-renewables, and eventually, by definition, all non-renewables are being used up and becoming harder and harder to reach what's left of them, we will have to live on renewable resources. And so David Pimentel at Cornell did a really interesting analysis in which he said, okay, we're going to probably in this century be at a point where we're living only on renewables. What can we sustain at the Western European lifestyle? And his calculations led to the answer, 2 billion. We're now at just under 8 billion. So shrinking populations through achieving smaller family norms is the only way we will have a soft landing once oil, coal, and gas are out of the picture. And it's particularly
But
important.
Bill, that means if you've got to shrink from something like 9 billion down to 2 billion, I don't know in what period of time, but you're going to be talking about a replacement rate less than 1. We don't
Exactly.
even, I mean, most people won't be able to reproduce at all, right?
Well, there certainly are calculations that show we could level off by the middle of the century and begin a gradual decline by the second half of the century towards a sustainable level. And the question is, between non-renewables and technologies that increase our efficiency, can we achieve a soft landing before we're only dependent on renewables? And it's an open question, and the answer will change with technology. But certainly there are many couples around the world who are so concerned about climate change, they're deciding not to have any children because they worry about the future of their children and grandchildren. And in the West, it's particularly important. Two statisticians at Oregon State University calculated that having one less child by an American couple is a contribution to the health of the climate 5.7 times greater than their own personal emissions over the lifetime of their offspring over a couple of generations. So these are decisions that I think and data that really require us to honor people who choose to have small families and to not discriminate against people who have chosen to be child-free, and to celebrate countries like Japan that are much more likely to achieve sustainability through shrinking population than countries that are paying people to have more babies.
Bill, the report that estimated that 2 billion would be the peak sustainable, I mean, we population. I've seen others that suggest that 10 billion might be a danger level that we don't want to hit before we start reaching population decline later this century. But I haven't heard 2 billion. What were the factors that what were the things that it said would be obstacles beyond 2 billion? I mean, I could only assume that it would have been based on current carbon-based technology and that sort of thing. If we can achieve a carbon neutral, a net zero economy, surely there would not be any technical limits to population growth. Particularly given that we at 7 billion, we already produce like considerably more food than the 7 billion need. Achieving
a carbon-free economy is a big if. Mm-hmm. We haven't done that yet. And so basing our planning on, oh, maybe we'll achieve a carbon-free economy is taking us out on a limb that I think we obviously can avoid. There is certainly a case to be made that with new technologies, we may be able to support more than 2 billion. I think this calculation was done around the year 2000. So it may be quite the case that we could support 3 billion. But there's another issue here, and it ties into climate, and that is UN Environment Program report 2 years ago pointed out that expanding human habitation and expanding human farming are the primary drivers of loss of biodiversity. So in fact, loss of biodiversity is both a climate issue and a habitability issue more broadly, in that it's the web of life on the planet that makes the planet habitable. And if we destroy enough rainforests, the planet will become uninhabitable even without climate change. So it's, I think, important not to think we can just grow our way out of problems that growth has also contributed to.
Right, although the rainforest is a dangerous example, although it's not deforested in order to grow food, is the thing. It's deforested to grow non-food crops for the
Well, they
most part.
say cattle, you know, that
There's some cattle grazing as well, it's true. But I mean, generally the trend over the last 60 years has been that we've needed a smaller and smaller growing area to produce the amount of food we do. We have food surpluses now worldwide, although the next year could be tricky. We have food surpluses worldwide on a lot smaller land food footprint than we were using 20 years ago to grow considerably less food, because we're able to stretch it. And I mean, I was just talking about this with people in India. Most of India produces one crop per year and could easily produce 3 crops per year on the same land. I think we had a conversation about this in an earlier meeting. If it just had better agricultural and more sustainable agricultural tactics, it could produce 3 times as much food on the same area of land. So I mean, I do think you're right that expanding the planted footprint is not a good idea, but it's not something that's necessarily growing right now, and could shrink. We could squeeze considerably more food output out of the same land.
well, that's true, but also the reality is that we're going to, within 10 years, people are predicting famine, not from the current reason. I mean, the only reason we have famines now is acts of war, basically, or human rights violations.
Every famine in modern history has been a political act, not a climate act.
In modern history, but now they're expecting that it will be in fact caused largely by, or more and more by climate issues with drought and so on. I mean, even the Canadian Midwest, where, you know, prairies are having drought and are going to lose their crops and so on. So we you know, it's going to happen. And it is, but we have to increase the acreage at the same time, and
Yeah,
as we expect that we're going to be losing acreage because
and engineer a lot of new hybrids that can grow in more marginal climates, like we did at the beginning of the 20th century, to make Canada a farmable place.
Mm-hmm. But it is true that modern technology has made agriculture a hell of a lot more efficient. I was talking to somebody about meat production, and you know, the quality of how much dairy products you can get from a cow. Well, North America has much more, you know, enormous production of meat and milk from a shrinking number of cows. So it's amazing. You'd think these guys are going to blow up one of these days.
All the statistics on the government website and so on don't mention contributions of the military to climate change. And what should we do to point that out and reduce weapons manufacture and wars and so on?
Mm-hmm. I just talked to Tamara Lawrence, who's going over there to make that case, you know, because her main research has to do with the connection between militarism and climate emission, you know, carbon emissions and climate change. And I asked if she's going to be the only person. No, there's going to be a whole crowd of people trying to make that point. I don't know whether that's where you can make the point, because it's up to the countries to decide whether or not they will allow that to be part of their carbon budget, you know. And as far as I know, there's nothing in the Paris Agreement saying that you have to count military, you know, equipment or technology as against your carbon budget. I think they basically excluded that. They certainly excluded from the Kyoto Accord, but I think it's also almost absent from, I believe there's some reference to it in the Paris Agreement, but it's not specific enough to make anybody really accountable. Claire, you have your hand up. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I just want to say that one of the ways to fix military is have everyone peaceful.
Oh, okay.
It's Quebec peace and
All right.
shirt. And
That's not a, just go ahead, please.
if we can have everyone peaceful, then they won't like to spend all the money on military that they don't need. For example, I think China's being a little bit careful with that, not starting a world war, hopefully. And I'm hoping that maybe they can make a federation with Taiwan and Hong Kong to work together peacefully rather than blowing each other up. And I think that they really have to work on peace. Peace is it's like a recipe. You can't let things fall apart. You work on it. So and try to get people not to spend so much money on military.
Well, now, please elaborate on this idea of a federation between China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. I heard you mention that before, and I thought, well, that's an idea, but I don't know who's going to go for it. Did you about to say something, Doug? Did I interrupt you?
No, I just want to say that I think there is a lot to what Claire's saying, in that it should be fairly easy to decarbonize militaries because of the nature of them as organizations and as purchasers. They use the type of technology that should be generally fairly easy as far as things go to make carbon neutral and electrified, because they're centralized organizations that can create power on a central grid and use electric vehicles and that sort of thing. And they do their purchasing centrally and acquiring. But I think, as Claire says, the problem is not militaries, but it's wars. A carbon neutral war is an impossibility. I mean, among the worst places you'll ever see, just as far as burning off things and destroying the environment, is a country at war. I've never seen anything like it. Just the scale of waste and destruction of land and of livelihoods and so on. So the paradox is, I think, and there are lots of countries that are going to have huge militaries but never go to war because they use militaries as basically their main welfare source and so on. So I think the idea that you can decarbonize militaries by making sure they don't go to war is a good one, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk about this thing, Claire. You've said this concept of a federation. Now, sounds like a very peaceful kind of solution, because when I hear of the threats between China, or China's threats against both Taiwan, and obviously they've succeeded in capturing back Hong Kong, then I get pretty nervous. But and I couldn't imagine a peaceful solution to that. Now, if you could think of a federation where almost everything was independent, then you could think of Taiwan as being in a federation with China, but really not totally dominated or subjected to Xi's policies. I don't know how you would possibly negotiate such a thing. It sounds to me like a pipe dream, but it is an interesting term, the notion of federation, which sounds perfectly benign and might even be attractive to somebody. I don't know who. Where did you get the idea of a federation?
I'm a world federalist, a global citizen. And I think that, people can talk and get along together. Nobody wants to lose their sovereignty. That's the first thing you have to know. And so everybody is important, and you just work on things that you can agree with. Sometimes it's just trade, small little things like trade. And then everyone wants their own culture, though. We're not integrating people that don't want to be integrated. They can have their own ethnic thing as long as they don't keep everybody awake by calls to prayer. If they do, then they're going to talk about it and solve their problems at a local level. And that's the way you get rid of weapons.
Well, I had a talk show a while back where Alan Ben-Meir was proposing a federation of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And he makes a very convincing kind of case for it. But the thing about this is the one thing they don't, they have to all be unified on would be foreign policy. You might be able to come up with a federation in which people do their local domestic issues with what you call sovereignty. But every federation, I think, would have to have some sort of common foreign policy, wouldn't it?
I don't think so. You can have different opinions, like the mother to tell you one thing and father's going to tell you a different thing. And some things would be a bit unified, but I think that each situation would be judged by the different countries, and they would figure out what to do for a certain length of time, or paying a certain amount of money, or transferring something to equalize things a bit. For example, between the developed and developing countries, it'd be really nice if we could help support them with more money and encouragement, and not let them starve, because that makes people very unhappy. So I'm just thinking that we need more ties between we used to have twinning of countries. Somebody said there's even twinning now between a sustainable bond and a regular bond.
Yeah, but that's not really federation. A federation is creating to some extent, a single polity. And I guess it could vary in all kinds of ways what you write into your system. But the one thing that, so far as I know, all federations have in common is they would have to have a single foreign policy. Doug, have you ever heard of any federation that looked to having sovereignty with regard to international affairs?
Well, the European Union talks about it a lot. It's one of the areas where each of the 27 countries is allowed its sovereignty. Sort of. Well, I mean, you can't strike an international deal with any individual European country in most areas. You have to strike it with Brussels. But they do have their individual foreign policies. You don't get a lot of examples of a country joining another, with the exception of the European Union, which is an important exception and a good thing. The only example I can think of in modern history of one country joining another was Scotland joining England to form Britain. And that was sort of voluntarily, but a large part of the Scottish population were not particularly into it at the time. And in fact, that particular union may end very soon as a consequence of Brexit and Scottish anger over that. But the EU is a good and functioning example of a federation like that. And it's become more federated recently during the pandemic crisis. The one aspect of it that had never really been done and was causing it to fail, which was having shared fiscal responsibilities, shared ability to raise taxes and have a budget across the whole thing, and have transfer payments from richer countries to poorer countries. Well, they do that now as a consequence of the pandemic. And it's like any family, like Claire says, in that, lots of people, nobody loves everybody else. They all hate each other and all that sort of thing, but it has prevented any of them from going to war. Now, I cannot imagine that in China right now, just because People's Republic of China is not a democracy, which tends to mitigate against the ability to cooperate or form. And it also has just conquered one of those three entities in a brutal way and is threatening to do it with the other one, with Taiwan, which makes any possibility of cooperation very difficult. Taiwan's ready. I mean, although Taiwan is the home in exile of what should have been the legitimate democratic government of China. Back in the 80s, they gave up their formal claims to be the legitimate government of China. Beijing has not given up the claim to be the legitimate government of Taiwan. So I think any thought of greater cooperation between those three entities under humane norms is going to need to wait a generation. There are many who hope that something will cause Xi Jinping to no longer be in office, and that somebody more encouraging, like some of the leaders who came before him, will come into power. But right now it looks like he's got a pretty tight hold on things, and the worry is that the next leader after him will literally be the military.
And he looks pretty healthy to me. Yeah.
Well, there's always talk of, is there palace intrigue, and will there be a coup, and all that sort of thing. But China's like, what was it the guy said about Hollywood? Nobody knows nothing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, it's an idea to be encouraged, Claire, but I think you got a way to go before we're going to get to unify those three polities. Before signing off, I want to toss in a concern I have about COP, which is I talk to a lot of people about methane, and I am now of the opinion that methane is as much a threat as CO2. And it may be, in fact, it's now, I think the amount that of greenhouse, of global warming capacity that's accounted for by methane is 60% of the amount accounted for by CO2, which is already alarming. And as I understand it, for some reason, the scientists in the panel, the IPCC, have downplayed the importance of methane, underestimating it consistently, and I don't know why. But it's not just the current amount that's being emitted from things like fracking and all these other sources, largely cow burps, but also the much more serious possibility of an almost explosive eruption of methane from the East Siberian Sea. And apparently some of the experts who on the Arctic, on sea ice, discount that and don't pay attention to the threat, and have even suppressed publications that dwell on that, and they emphasize that, because they say, well, methane is, yes, it's at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. It's held down by a layer of permafrost at the bottom of the ocean. And yes, the permafrost is melting and is emitting bubbles of methane, but don't worry about it, because methane dissolves in water. Therefore, it will never reach the surface, which is true if you're talking about deep water. But the East Siberian Sea is a shallow shelf, and it's just 40 meters deep or something like that. And the plumes of methane coming up are extraordinary. I have seen one video of a ship going through that region, And it's like being on a plane going through clouds. It's everywhere out there. And then, except the difference is you can see these things popping up, little puffs of them ahead of you as a new bubble emits. But otherwise, you're flying through clouds of methane, such that if you were there with a cigarette, it'd probably explode. It's really flammable stuff. And the amount that's there is a staggering thing. And as I understand it, it is being minimized, or even, I don't know what the polite word for it is, but I would call it censored by scientists who don't want to believe that that's important for some reason. Now, if COP comes and goes and they don't have a good discussion of methane, I think that we've really missed the boat.
Meta, there's an article in the Washington Post today that really drives this home under the headline, Russia allows methane leaks at planet's peril. But it's a much larger investigation where about the people who use satellite technology to detect these giant clouds of methane, which you couldn't do before. And it recounts a couple of incidents even this year where a single gas pipeline burst in Russia completely flooded the whole Eurasian continent with methane for a very long period. Over a couple of days, it put out more methane every hour than the whole planet usually does in several days for quite some time. And they now have this high technology detection to realize how much methane is coming out of Russia now from various means and other places. And it says exactly like you did, Meta, that it's the amount being expelled and emitted is just off the charts right now.
And it could be it could be a leak slow enough, or it could be almost overnight. It could be a big explosive kind of thing. I don't know, overnight, maybe an exaggeration, but within a year, it would be catastrophic there. You might call it an extinction event, because it's really a turning point if that amount. The Laptev Sea, for example, has a huge reservoir of methane under it. So really, if they don't take that seriously and get to work on trying to solve the problem, and the truth is there isn't any good solution. There is no way to capture this stuff right now. The only solution that has any promise is this cloud brightening thing. And people are afraid to even experiment with it. They call it geoengineering, and that's the reason all you need to do is say that word and everybody runs for cover in the other direction. They don't like that word. But what else have you got? Not much.
You can collect it from a cow and use it to heat things in India.
Okay.
I noticed that Elon Musk, the billionaire, this week announced, claimed that he would give $100 million to somebody who could give him a design for a technology that would remove carbon in large volumes from the atmosphere and store it safely, which is, to be fair, a thing that all of the projections of the policy goals to reach net zero say that we're going to have to develop, and so on. And maybe it's a positive sign that famously greedy billionaires are willing to spend money to try to be the one who captures the profit off of that technology.
Well, you capture it with these things that David Keith is putting up on the West Coast, where you have these big fans and you suck it out of the atmosphere. It's not economically feasible to do it now, but if you're going to make concrete out of it, which is how they use it, then that sequesters your CO2 forever in your concrete, and you have a way to put it away, and it becomes carbon negative. So there you go. There's Bob's your uncle.
Okay, on that optimistic note.
Okay, guys, this has been fun. Sorry I talked too much, but
Thanks for organizing this.
Okay, great fun. Have a good show. Break a leg, Bill.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, take care, guys. Bye-bye.